The man who called himself Silas Blackwood is a creature of routine. He rises with the gray promise of dawn, breathes in the scent of sage and dust, and surveys his domain from the porch of his small, sturdy cabin. His world is one of fences that need mending, a creek that runs thin in the summer, and the profound, aching silence of the high plains. For a year, that silence has been his only companion. But for the past 3 months, a new element has been added to his morning ritual. A woman. She appears just as the sun's first rays crest the jagged peaks to the east, a solitary figure moving with a purpose that seems both sorrowful and grim. She walks to the forgotten potter's field that borders his land, a place of unmarked stones and wind-whipped weeds. There, she stops at one particular mound of earth, barely distinguishable from the others. She kneels, her head bowed, and she speaks. Silas is too far away to hear the words, can only see the soft movement of her lips and the earnest inclination of her body. She speaks to the grave every morning, a low, murmuring conversation with the dead. The townspeople in Redemption Gulch call her the Mad Widow, a whisper that follows her like a stray dog when she buys her meager supplies. But Silas, watching from the quiet judgment of his porch, sees something else. He sees not madness, but a fierce, desperate devotion. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The woman's name, he learned, is Alara. She drifts at the edges of town life, a ghost in a threadbare dress. She takes what work she can find, mending, scrubbing, weeding, for pennies and leftover bread, and retreats to a shack that looks as if it might surrender to the next strong wind. Her grief, Silas assumes, must be a bottomless well. He knows the shape of that emptiness. He carries his own, a quieter, more weathered version for the wife and child the fever took 3 winters ago. Yet, something about Alara's ritual pricks at him. Her visits are not just sorrowful, they are vigilant. Her eyes, when she stands to leave, sweep the horizon with a caution that grief alone doesn't explain. But it wasn't her grief that finally broke through his quiet observation. It was the soil. One morning, after a dry spell, he noticed it through his field glass. The earth on that particular mound was just a little looser, a fraction darker than the sun-baked clay around it. It looked tended, disturbed, as if someone were not leaving flowers, but checking on what lay beneath. The silence of Silas's life had settled into his bones. It lived in the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods by the creek, and the empty chair across his small kitchen table. He'd bought this ranch after Martha and little Sam were gone, seeking a place so vast and quiet that the memories would have room to scatter. He worked from before sunrise till after sunset, letting the burn in his muscles chase the ache from his heart. He was a man whittled down to necessity, his words as sparse as the trees on his land. Alara had arrived in Redemption Gulch like a tumbleweed, unannounced and unattached. The town, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings and suspicious eyes, took one look at her haunted gaze and patched dress and made up its mind. Whispers followed her from the mercantile to the smithy. The loudest belonged to Beatrice Gable, the portly wife of the town mayor, who held court over sacks of flour and bolts of calico. The Mad Widow of Potter's Field. Silas had heard her declare one afternoon while he was buying salt licks. Talks to a ghost, they say. Poor thing's got a cracked pot for a mind, the other women had clucked in agreement, their pity edged with the cruel satisfaction of the secure. Silas had said nothing. He'd paid for his supplies, tipped his hat, and walked out, the women's voices fading behind him. He didn't know what drove Alara to that patch of lonely earth, but he recognized the look of a survivor. Madness was loud, chaotic. Alara was quiet, methodical. Her every movement was weighted with a purpose he couldn't name, but respected nonetheless. His land was his sanctuary, the fences marking a clear line between his world and the town's petty judgments. The potter's field lay in a gray area between the two, belonging to no one and everyone, a final, forgotten repository for the luckless and the unknown. Her daily pilgrimage was an intrusion, a subtle disruption to his ordered solitude. He found himself timing his morning coffee to her arrival, his gaze drawn to her small, determined form against the immense backdrop of the plains. He started noticing the details. She never brought flowers. She didn't weep. Her posture was one of conference, not mourning. One evening, driven by a curiosity that felt like a betrayal of his own privacy, he rode the perimeter of his property, his path taking him near the field. He didn't go to the grave itself, but from a short distance, he could see it more clearly. There was no headstone, not even a wooden cross, just a slightly raised rectangle of earth. And around it, almost invisible unless you were looking for them, were tiny, meticulously placed pebbles marking its four corners. It wasn't the haphazard mound of a pauper's burial. It was a demarcation, a claim. A few days later, he saw her not at the grave, but in the scrubland that led to it, her head bent low. She was gathering plants, her fingers moving with an expert swiftness as she selected certain leaves and roots, placing them in a small cloth sack. She wasn't just foraging for weeds. She was harvesting, with the knowledge of an apothecary. The image didn't fit with the town's narrative of a witless waif. That night, a cold snap descended from the mountains. Silas thought of her shack, of the gaps in the walls he could see from the road. He loaded a wheelbarrow with a generous pile of split pine from his own woodpile, and, under the cover of a starless sky, he walked the half-mile to her door and left it on her stoop. He didn't knock. He just left the wood and retreated back into his silence, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. He had crossed a line, from observer to participant, and he wasn't sure what it meant. The sky had been a bruised purple for 2 days, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a reckoning. Clouds gathered over the peaks, a slow, menacing army rolling down into the valley. Silas knew the signs. This wouldn't be a gentle spring shower. It was a gully washer, the kind of storm that could turn his dry creek bed into a raging brown torrent in under an hour. His first thought was for his livestock, moving them to the high ground near the barn. His second, nagging and persistent, was of the potter's field. It sat in a low-lying basin, the first place the runoff would collect. A knot of anxiety tightened in his gut. The loose soil he'd noticed, the careful arrangement of it all, a flood would wash it away, expose whatever secret she was keeping. He found himself saddling his horse, his movements brisk and decisive. He wasn't sure what he intended to do. Warn her? Offer a shovel? The impulse was irrational, a pull towards her predicament that overrode his instinct for solitude. He rode out just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the dust and releasing the rich, earthy scent of petrichor. He saw her from a distance, already there, a frantic silhouette against the darkening sky. She wasn't talking to the grave now. She was fighting for it, hauling large, flat stones from a nearby rock fall and trying to build a crude barrier around the mound. Her dress was already soaked, plastered to her thin frame, her hair whipping across her face in the rising wind. He dismounted and walked toward her, the ground already softening under his boots. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with a feral panic, like a cornered animal. She expected judgment, perhaps, or a command to leave. He offered neither. He simply walked past her, found a large, manageable piece of shale, and placed it next to hers, fitting it into the growing wall. For a moment, she just stared at him, rain dripping from her chin. Then, a shudder went through her, and she turned back to her task, her movements even more desperate. They worked in silence, a strange, unspoken alliance against the storm. The wind howled, and the rain came down in stinging sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, so close the ground vibrated. He was a big man, strong from years of hard labor, and his progress was swift and steady. Her strength was of a different kind, a wiry, relentless endurance that refused to yield. He paused to wipe the rain from his face, his gaze falling on her hands. They were raw and bleeding, her fingernails broken. His jaw tightened. This was more than devotion. This was protection. "Who's buried here?" he asked, his voice nearly lost in the gale. It was a simple question, but it landed like a physical blow. She froze, her back rigid. She clutched a rock to her chest, as if it were a shield. He saw the war in her eyes, the instinct to lie, the terror of the truth. She shook her head, a small, sharp gesture of denial, and slammed the rock into place. Her silence was a fortress, but his presence beside her, his sweat and effort mingling with hers, was already tunneling through the walls. The storm was getting worse. and as a rivulet of water breached their makeshift levee, it washed away a corner of the carefully tended soil. For a fleeting second, before Alara scrambled to cover it, Silas saw it. Not the rotted wood of an old coffin, but the clean, straight edge of a sealed wooden crate. They were losing the battle. The water was rising faster now, pooling around the mound, turning the earth to slurry. Alara was shivering violently, her lips tinged with blue. She was going to collapse if she stayed out here any longer. "It's enough," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. He put a hand on her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away. Her skin was ice cold. "You have to get out of the storm." Tears of frustration and fear streamed down her face, indistinguishable from the rain. "I can't," she choked out. "I can't leave it. It will be here when the storm passes," he said, a lie meant to soothe. He wasn't sure it would be. "You won't be, if you stay." He didn't give her a choice. He half led, half supported her towards his horse. As he helped her mount, his eyes scanned the road back to town. Through the gray curtain of rain, he saw another rider, a man in a slicker sitting atop a horse on a distant rise. Sheriff Brody. The man was checking on the outlying properties, ensuring folks were prepared. Brody's gaze lingered on them for a long moment. The solitary rancher and the town's madwoman, together in a deluge at an unmarked grave. Then, the sheriff turned his horse and rode on. But Silas knew the image had been noted, filed away in Brody's orderly mind. Their association was now a matter of public record, a new piece of gossip for the town to chew on. Back in the warmth and dry of his cabin, the storm raged outside, a wild counterpoint to the thick silence within. He gave Alara a heavy wool blanket and a steaming mug of coffee, which she cradled in her trembling hands. He stoked the fire in the hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. He could feel her watching him, her gaze filled with a fragile mix of terror and exhaustion. He didn't press her. He didn't ask about the crate. He just sat in the other chair, offering the simple, profound gift of his quiet presence. He saw now that the town was wrong. This woman wasn't mad. She was hunted. Finally, her voice, small and raspy, cut through the sound of the wind and rain. "It's not a grave," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the fire. "It's all I have left." The story came out in a torrent, as if the storm outside had broken a dam within her. Her name was Alara Vance. Her father, a brilliant and gentle man named Alastair, had been an apothecary, but he was more of an artist, a botanist with a deep understanding of the earth's secrets. His life's work was a healing salve, a unique compound of mountain herbs and a cultured moss that could close wounds, draw out infection, and soothe burns in a way that seemed miraculous. He hadn't created it for profit, but for people. A ruthless businessman from Denver, Elias Thorne, had heard of the salve. Thorne owned a dozen lucrative and often fraudulent patent medicine ventures. He saw Alastair's creation not as a miracle, but as a gold mine. He'd offered to buy the formula. Alastair, knowing Thorne would dilute it and sell it at exorbitant prices, had refused. Thorne, a man unaccustomed to refusal, had not taken it well. He'd used his wealth and influence to ruin him. He'd bribed officials and paid for false testimony, framing Alastair for selling his remedies to a notorious gang of outlaws, claiming he was patching up criminals to aid their depredations. It was a lie, but it was a believable one. Alastair Vance had died in a prison infirmary before he could even be brought to trial, a victim of neglect and a broken heart. But just before they'd taken him away, he'd told Alara what to do. He had packed everything, his priceless journals filled with decades of research, the carefully preserved starter cultures for the moss, and the small cache of gold he'd saved, into a waterproofed shipping crate. He'd made her bury it, telling her to choose a place of sorrow, a place no one would ever want to disturb. "Go to ground, little bird," he had told her. "Be invisible until the shadow passes." So she had fled, taking on the guise of a destitute, grieving widow. She'd chosen Redemption Gulch for its isolation, and the Potter's Field for its anonymity. Her daily visits were not for mourning, but for maintenance. She was checking the seals, ensuring the earth hadn't settled too much, and keeping up the performance that kept her safe. Her speaking to the grave was a quiet recitation of her father's formulas, a way to keep his memory and his work alive in her mind. But Thorne's men were still looking. They knew Alastair had journals, and they knew he had a daughter. Thorne wanted that formula, and he would not stop until he had it. As she finished, the fire crackled in the hearth. The weight of her story settled in the small cabin, a burden far heavier than any storm. Silas looked at her, at the raw courage it had taken to survive, to maintain that lonely, desperate vigil. His respect for her, already significant, deepened into a profound admiration. "The flood," she said, her voice hollow. "The crate will be exposed. And Brody saw us," Silas added, his mind already working. "The town will talk. If Thorne has ears anywhere, word could get back that the Mad Widow has an ally." The fragile safety of her hiding place was gone. They both knew it. A new, dangerous phase had begun. "We have to move it," she stated, her voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. "Tonight," Silas agreed without hesitation. "Under the cover of the storm's end. We'll bring it here. Hide it in the barn." The decision hung in the air, a silent pact. He was no longer just an observer, or even a helper. He was a conspirator. He was choosing to stand with her, to take on her risk as his own. He rose and pulled on his still damp coat. "I'll get the lanterns and a spade. And my rifle." Alara watched him, and for the first time since he'd met her, the fear in her eyes was eclipsed by something else, a fragile, dawning glimmer of trust. She nodded, standing up and pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, no longer a victim waiting for the flood, but a partner preparing for a fight. The world was a wreck of mud and broken branches. The storm had passed, leaving a sky scrubbed clean and littered with stars. A pale sliver of moon cast an eerie glow over the potter's field, turning the pools of standing water into silver mirrors. The air was cold and clean, thick with the smell of wet earth. They worked with a grim, quiet efficiency, the squelch of their boots in the mud and the rhythmic scrape of Silas's spade the only sounds. The crate was heavier than it looked, suctioned into the muck. It took both of them, grunting with effort, to finally break it free. They were sliding it onto a piece of canvas Silas had brought to use as a sledge when the sound came. The unmistakable metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Two riders emerged from the shadows of a stand of junipers on the rise. They were silhouetted against the moonlight, their forms menacing and indistinct. "That'll be far enough," a gravelly voice called out. "Mr. Thorne sends his regards. He'll be taking that box now." Silas moved without thinking, stepping in front of Alara, his own Winchester coming up to his shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion. The men urged their horses forward, stopping a dozen yards away. They were hard-faced men, the kind who did ugly work for pay, their eyes cold and empty. "This is private property," Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble. It was a lie, but a plausible one. "This is my family's plot. You're trespassing." The lead rider chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "We ain't here for a history lesson, rancher. We're here for what rightfully belongs to our employer. The girl knows what's in the box. Give it up, and we'll be on our way. No one needs to get hurt. This land and everything on it is under my protection," Silas stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I suggest you turn your horses around." Beside him, Alara moved. He felt a brief flash of fear that she would bolt, but she didn't. She reached down to the small cloth sack still tied at her waist, the one he'd seen her use for harvesting herbs. With a swift, fluid motion, she untied it. The second man, growing impatient, began to dismount. "I wouldn't," Alara said, her voice clear and ringing in the night air, stripped of all its previous fear. It was the voice of Alistair Vance's daughter. As the man's boot touched the ground, she flung the contents of her sack with a whip-like motion of her arm. It wasn't a rock or a weapon Silas could recognize. It was a fine, dark powder that hung in the air for a moment before drifting towards the men. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The dismounted man's horse screamed, a sound of pure agony, and began to buck wildly, its eyes rolling. The man himself cried out, clawing at his face as he staggered back. "Hellebore powder," Alara said, her voice tight with fury. "Concentrated. My father used it to keep pests from his garden. I find it works just as well on vermin." The first rider, startled by the chaos, fumbled with his reins. It was the opening Silas needed. He didn't fire to kill. He fired at the ground just in front of the man's horse. The shot boomed through the quiet field, and the animal reared, panicked. The rider fought for control, his attention completely diverted. Silas closed the distance in 3 long strides, grabbing the barrel of the man's rifle and wrenching it from his grasp. He tossed it into the deepest pool of water nearby. The other man was still on the ground, moaning and rubbing his eyes. In seconds, the standoff was over. "Get him on his horse and get off my land," Silas snarled, his face inches from the lead riders. "You tell Elias Thorne that Alara Vance is no longer alone. You tell him this is Redemption Gulch, and we protect our own." The man, his bravado shattered, scrambled to help his partner, hoisting him into the saddle. They cast one last look of hatred and fear at the 2 figures standing over the crate, then spurred their panicked horses into a clumsy retreat, disappearing back into the night. Silence descended once more, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. They were alone, covered in mud, standing over a box of secrets in a desecrated field. The immediate threat was gone. Silas looked at Alara. Her face was pale in the moonlight, streaked with mud, but her eyes blazed with a fierce, defiant light he had never seen before. In that moment, she was not the mad widow or a frightened refugee. She was magnificent. Their alliance, born of circumstance and sealed in a storm, had just been forged anew in fire and defiance. His solitary life, he knew with absolute certainty, was over for good. The crate sat on the floor of his barn, smelling of damp earth and possibility. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting a warm, gentle glow. Exhaustion had settled deep into their bones, but it was a good kind of weariness, the kind that comes after a battle won. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, the unasked questions of the future hanging gently between them. He watched her as she stared into the flames, her profile softened by the firelight. He saw the strength that had been hidden beneath layers of feigned madness and real fear. He saw the intelligence that the town had mistaken for insanity, and the resilience that had allowed her to endure. "What will you do now?" he asked softly, finally breaking the quiet. She turned to look at him, her gaze direct and clear. "Start over," she said. Her eyes flickered around the simple, sturdy cabin, at the well-scrubbed wooden table, the neatly stacked firewood, the worn but solid chairs. "A home. Here," she added, her voice barely a whisper. "If you'll have me." A feeling of profound rightness, of things clicking into place after being disordered for too long, settled in Silas's chest. He simply nodded, a gesture that conveyed everything his sparse words could not. Weeks passed. The potter's field began to heal, the scar in the earth slowly grassing over, becoming anonymous once more. The gossip in town, fueled by Sheriff Brody's grudging report of chasing off claim jumpers from Silas Blackwood's land, had shifted. The mad widow was now the brave woman Silas had taken under his wing. Pity had been replaced by a reluctant respect. One bright, clear morning, Silas was out mending the fence line that bordered the field, tamping a new post into the firm earth. He paused, leaning on the post driver, and looked back toward the cabin. His cabin. Their cabin. The door was open. Alara was kneeling by the porch, not facing a mound of dirt, but tending to the small, fragrant herb garden she had planted in the sun-drenched soil. She was humming a quiet tune, her fingers gently tending a new sprout. The morning sun caught the gold in her hair, and for a moment, she seemed to glow with a light of her own. As if feeling his gaze, she looked up, her eyes finding his across the distance. A smile touched her lips, a real, unguarded smile of pure contentment that reached all the way to her eyes. Silas smiled back, a slow, unpracticed expression that felt more natural than any he'd worn in years. He thought of the man he was just a few months ago, a man who believed his life was a closed book, a story of duty and endings. He had been wrong. This was not an ending. This was the first sentence of a new chapter. His quiet ranch was no longer a place of solitude. It was a sanctuary, a home they had built together out of courage, kindness, and a secret buried in a lonely grave. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.